And it is good to be with you for the April edition of the Saul Zaentz Foundation's Meeting the Moment webinar. My name is Dan Worry. I am an author and a jack of all trades. It seems I wear many hats, but one that I am particularly proud of is being a strategic advisor to the Saul Zaentz Foundation, which is an organization that helps to uplift and extend the legacy of film and music producer Saul Zaentz. Today we have an important topic. It's one that seems like, unfortunately, sort of a perennial challenge and topic, and that is the economics of childcare. We know that millions of American families rely on the availability of childcare to participate in the workforce, but also for the early education and developmental needs of their young children. And yet, it is a very challenged space. We think of it as sort of a textbook case of a broken market, that it is more expensive than parents can afford, that it is unprofitable, that it is premised on the low wages of a primarily female workforce in many states, overwhelmingly women of color in this space. Our panel will help us to unpack all of those ideas and more. But today we're going to have a conversation in part around why it is important that we stabilize this market, and what are the consequences of our failure to do so as well. And so we have an absolutely fantastic panel with us today. Nancy Fishman is the National Director of Ready Nation. Robert Carl is President and CEO and is joined by his colleague Samantha Chavinsky, Executive Vice President of the Schuylkill Chamber of Commerce in Pennsylvania. Dr. Catherine Sadowski is joining us from Stanford University, where she is an economist specializing in childcare challenges, also an assistant professor of education. And our last panelist almost needs no introduction in this space. Elliot Haspel is a senior fellow at Capita and author of a number of really fantastic books on the childcare policy challenges, Crawling Behind, and most recently, Raising a Nation. And so we are thrilled to have all of you here with us. Before we kick into conversation, just as a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Um, we will take your questions at the a little bit later on in the hour. Invite you to jump in if you have a question for the panel. Please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom toolbar, rather than the chat. We invite you to use the chat all throughout the hour to respond to panelists, to meet and say hello to one another. But if you can isolate those questions to the Q&A, it'll be easier for us to find them when the time comes. So with that, let's kick into gear. One of the reasons, by the way, that we are holding this conversation today is that Ready Nation has put out recently what I consider a really important report in this space. I am fond of saying, Nancy, that lots of organizations put out lots of reports every year, but the report that Ready Nation put out now 2 or 3 years ago on the kind of the real-time drain on the American economy, based on the shortage or unavailability of high-quality infant toddler care in particular, was to me maybe the most important piece of work done in this space in recent years. You have recently revisited that topic and looked more closely at the economic impact of childcare writ large, not just that infant toddler space, and want to hear a little bit from you about that report today. But before we jump into the specifics of the report, maybe give a quick introduction to Ready Nation so that people understand the work that you do and the members that you work with.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be part of such a terrific panel. Ready Nation is a national network of business leaders who are willing to use their voices to help move policy that builds a strong workforce and economy by investing in young children and their families. We have members in all 50 states, And we work with allies in those states when they find it helpful to bring the business voice to add into the conversation. One of our hot issue areas this year, as you mentioned, is childcare.
Well, and so tell us a little bit more. I teased a little bit about the the report that is now a couple of years old that looked and the bottom line. It's it's interesting, and I'll let other panelists sort of weigh in on this more than I'll do it myself. But so often in this conversation, not just about childcare, but about early childhood investment, sort of generally, what we're the case that is made economically is that if we invest wisely now, that 20 years, 30 years in the future, that we will see substantial cost savings in terms of academic outcomes and less reliance on social welfare programs, better health outcomes. The list sort of goes on and on. The challenge there, though, we know is that for policymakers, they don't always seem to have the luxury of let's do something smart now that 30 years from now is gonna pay off in results. And so I have pointed consistently. In fact, in my own book, I think I cite extensively this study that you did a couple of years back that is unique in the sense that it looked real time, not 30 years from now or 20 years from now, but what was the real time drain on the American economy last year, this year, next year, if we don't get this right. And the bottom line at the time nationally was $122 billion with a B, a year. And so, and would continue, by the way, to recommend that study to anyone who is interested in looking. I think one of the most valuable pieces of that, and we can get into some of this too, is there's a wonderful appendix in that report that breaks that 122 billion down by state. And so, as you are talking to policymakers, that there's an ability to say, well, in Florida, the impact was this. So that was based on infants and toddlers. This recent report, though, looks a little bit more broadly. I know in the interim as well that you have done some individual state report. So talk us through kind of where we are now. What are the new headlines coming out here?
Absolutely. And you're right. And it's important to look long term, but what we need is an additional tool that looks at the short term and the right now with investments in childcare. Little audiovisual aid. It's childcare crisis now costs the economy $172 billion per year. And that's an impact on parents and on employers. I do want to clarify to your point, Dan, that our past reports surveyed parents of infants and toddlers, young children under the age of 3. For this report, the survey was for parents of children under the age of 5. So it's important that we not compare apples to apples when we look at the increase in the total economic impact. But what we can say is the dollar figures are going up. It's the childcare crisis is costing families more than it has in the past. So we look at that and it's impacting in a number of ways. We hired a survey firm that went out and talked to parents, interviewed parents about what's happening due to the lack of childcare. And they were very careful to say, because of the lack of childcare, have you ever been impacted by? And we see impacts in the areas of productivity, work penalties, time at work, and career opportunities. And the report goes into more detail on those. But really, because of the lack of childcare, parents have had to leave work early. They're distracted at work. Unfortunately, sometimes they've been demoted or had to have their hours reduced. They've been changed to part-time from full-time in some cases, and they've had to turn down trainings and promotions and other things because they are not able to get the childcare that they need. So the total impact per year, and again, we have to say per year because this is not going away, for individual parents is $6,980. And when we look at that across the nation for parents of kids under the age of 5, that's 134 billion with a B dollars. And the impact for employers is $1,970. And we look at that across the nation, that's 38 billion. So it's the 134 plus 38 that gets us to the $172 billion. Taxpayers are also impacted because of the lack of revenue going into the state and federal revenue streams. That adds up to about $37 billion per year, but that number is nestled in with the impact of parents. So we're not going to add another 37 billion, but we like to point that out because when parents can't work, that means companies can't work to their full potential, which means that all of us in the country are impacted. And I do want to share as well, please do look at the appendix in the back, which shows the state impact. That is an estimated number. We've had a chance to do some state-specific surveys in a couple cases, and that is noted in the appendix, but that is an estimated number. Dan, our big hope here is that people are able to use this report as one tool in the toolbox that shows that policymakers need to act in order to expand access to high quality childcare for all in order to grow our workforce and the economy.
Well, Nancy, it's fascinating, the looking at this from the perspective of the work that I have done in recent years with policymakers, state lawmakers, for example. I get into these conversations where, obviously this is a difficult job, creating a state budget. They're, thinking through, but I have over and over had policymakers say to me like, oh, the early childhood advocates are requesting, they want $50 million in new investment this year, which just isn't reasonable. And what's fascinating is when you compare sort of the ask against the data that you have pulled together, it is routinely, what they're asking tends to be a small fraction of what you are estimating their state is losing in real time. And so it's interesting when they say, "Oh well, gosh, they want an additional 50 million," and you flip to that appendix and say, "Oh well, did you know that your state's losing $3.5 billion every year as a result of this?" And so, I consider it a really important data set. One thing I was curious about, I don't know if you know the answer off the top of your head, but obviously there's this, we've got a $50 billion gulf sort of between what the original report suggested and now what this new report is suggesting. And as you mentioned, one was focused on children 3 and under, and this one is now based on children 5 and under, which, obviously will account for some of that difference. Do you have a sense from the new report? Has that impact in the infant toddler space continued to rise, or is this 172 billion primarily a function of adding a bigger population at this point, or maybe
Thank
both?
Thank you for asking. They were able to pull out a subset from the infant toddler space and say that the impact on parents has continued to rise. We did expand it to under 5 because so many of our allies working across the country said, can you give us numbers for kids before kindergarten? And
Mm.
we know most kids go to kindergarten at age 5. And so that's when they're often home and needing childcare. So give us that number. But when we break it down, we do see that the impact on parents continues to rise.
So continuing to accelerate, and then I want to jump in and talk to Bob and Samantha here in just a moment. But I know, and you mentioned, I mentioned that in the interim between these two large national reports that you have been doing some really deep dives into individual states. Is there anything you've learned from those individual state reports, whether sort of content wise or even methodologically, that has informed maybe the conversation at this point?
Yes, and it's not going to be any surprise to you, I'm sure, to hear that what we've learned is that the child care crisis is very complex and multifaceted, and that there is no one solution to this. And because there's no one right answer, we need to continue to approach this issue in whatever way makes the most sense in a state at any given time. When we look at the childcare workforce, maybe we're looking at subsidies for parents, maybe we're looking at expanding access. Then we need to keep an open mind and look at a variety of ways to improve childcare so that we can best help families in states in whatever way makes sense to them.
Well, and maybe as a segue now to Bob and Samantha, Nancy, one last question that I know Catherine and Elliot will want to weigh in on later as well. But it's interesting, even in my conversations with the sort of like National Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I've had conversations around how even just a couple of years ago, this was not as pressing an issue for business leaders. That it seems like COVID in a lot of ways really brought this to the forefront of conversation. But it's interesting, in talking with colleagues in other organizations, they've said, "Wow, we've really seen a difference here. This went from being something that." I rarely, if ever, heard about from business leaders to something that we're hearing about consistently every week. Now, your organization, as an organization of business leaders who are specifically interested in working in this space, might skew that perspective a little bit. But are you noticing more interest, accelerating interest in the business community nationally?
Absolutely. We are at the national level, federal level, and at the state level. We think that more employers are really understanding that this has to be a public-private partnership, that while businesses can do things internally, being able to use their voice and combine the data that we have with the stories that they can tell about the economic impact of lack of childcare for their own employees is what it takes to move policy. And I think the fact that it's more of a bipartisan issue than it was previously has really helped make the case for employers to weigh in.
Yeah. Well, let's turn now to Bob and Samantha, who are both of the Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. Bob, as a specific local chamber, when did childcare move from being kind of a family issue to being a chamber issue, a business issue for your members?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for having us, and thank you for the question. We've been at this for now over 3 years, Samantha and I, and it was kind of very simple. It came to us both by one industry cluster, meaning the childcare industry cluster, and we brought our childcare providers to the chamber. We had 40, 50 possible in different segments of childcare here, and we kind of heard their story, and then we coupled them up with our state legislators so the state legislators would hear the story. But the crisis was clear. The crisis clearly was growing. And I would say that to your point of why it may be getting even more acute, obviously post pandemic, there was, and a lot of people had to be sequestered at home. Then we had some movement going back into the workplace, and yet there was some delay there. So as more and more people over time started going back, post-pandemic, obviously the need for childcare became acute again. And in that whole time frame, unfortunately, the crisis had ramped up. And in fact, the number of providers had, quite frankly, also gone down. So as people were struggling to get back to work, the childcare crisis comes into play and now is a huge part of what we'll call workforce development. Next week here in Pennsylvania, we are going to get the Ready Nation report, which is a subsection of what Nancy's talking about. We've worked with Steve Doster. We met Steve Doster a number of years ago at our professional association, Pennsylvania Association of Chamber Professionals. And quite frankly, meeting Steve and getting involved in this issue has changed Samantha and my life in a lot of different ways. But our passion for this issue has grown immensely, and that's because this crisis needs help. It really needs all of our help. These costs are growing, the lost productivity in our workforce is growing, and next week, Pennsylvania's report is going to show, much like Nancy talked about on the national level, another $1 billion annual increase, which will cost totally in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania economy, 6 billion of the 172 that Nancy is referring to. So what we did in the beginning, not only listening to the child care providers, and Samantha's going to talk about this in 1 minute. She did some tremendous work here surveying back through our child care providers to our parents, and the data is staggering, and she's going to share some of that. But the survey really showed that, we are in big trouble, that 80% of parents said they did not have a backup plan if their child care provider closed its doors, if in fact they were lucky enough to have child care. 84% of the parents said they would be faced with hardship to keep their jobs if child care providers closed. And she has a lot of not only data, but she has a lot of anecdotal stories that just back all that up. In Schuylkill County, we lost 12% of our child care providers since the beginning of the pandemic, and we didn't have enough to begin with. So losing 12% is another significant hardship. Here in Pennsylvania, we're down about 400 providers from a number of years ago. Obviously, pandemic, some related, some not. This is a tough business, and you've got to have a lot of fortitude to not only run a child care facility, but stay in it. So we were able, when we see this crisis across Pennsylvania, and now thanks to Nancy, Ready Nation, Steve Doster, and many others, we've now taking this to a national level. But here in Pennsylvania, we knew we needed to get the attention of our legislators. And what we did was we formed, one by one, a coalition that has now become 75, growing to 80, mostly chambers of commerce, some economic development organizations advocating for a solution. And we did get finally a solution to this here in Pennsylvania when the Shapiro administration, Governor Shapiro, and his Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis have been very, very supportive of doing something in this field, in the child care industry field. And what we were able to do was, for the first time since the year 2007, the governor created a new line item for child care in the state budget last year, 25 million, which was intended and has been distributed across child care teachers as a bonus to child care teachers, hopefully incentivizing those that are in the field to stay, and possibly new ones that are coming in to consider coming in. We're also working on, obviously, tax credits in Pennsylvania, and tax credits are great, and we think it's a tool for business. The problem with tax credits are not every business is going to prioritize tax credits at the highest level of employee benefits. Healthcare has got to be number one. There's some others that usually follow. Tax credits can be in the regime, but not every business is going to offer tax credits. And quite frankly, the reason we're focusing on teachers and trying to keep teachers and get new teachers into the field is very simple. If there's no childcare teachers, there's no classrooms. And if there's no classrooms, there's no opening for parents to put their kids into a childcare setting. Samantha and I had one similar experience. Samantha's daughter experienced probably one of our premier childcare providers here in Pennsylvania and in Schuylkill County, the Perception Training Center, which is a Montessori school, an excellent childcare facility. Her daughter benefited from it. I have a personal experience. My granddaughter is fortunate enough to be in that school right now. And we know this. We know that if we're going to say, as a society, which we know is factually true, that child care is foundational, that the formative years of a child's life comes between infancy and some say the age of 5, but whether it's 5 or it's the age of 8, it's in those early years. And if we do not prioritize those early years and we struggle to get children into child care, the ramifications of that falls right in to elementary education and beyond, that we, quite frankly, in the United States of America and Pennsylvania, always fund, always take care of, year after year after year. But by the fact that so many young people are not having a child care environment to benefit from, these ramifications fall into the next level of education. And in some cases, sadly, we lose our children at very early stages that are very, very, very difficult to recover from. But I'd like to turn to Samantha, who can share more of the critical data that really tells the story.
Yeah, Bob, well said. And Samantha, I definitely want to hear from you. You know, it's interesting. This conversation always makes me think of, one of the most vivid memories of my professional career came sort of relatively early on, maybe at the height of COVID. I was working with a state in the Midwest and helped the governor and lieutenant governor at that time to seat a roundtable discussion with some of the biggest employers in the state around their challenges with childcare. And I always sort of say it was it felt at the moment like sort of a risky thing to do. I had no idea what these leaders were going to say. They were invited not because they had solicited us or, had reached out with their child care story. They were invited because they were roughly the dozen largest employers in this state. And they came, they sat around a conference table with the governor and lieutenant governor, and one by one told an absolute horror story about the challenges they were facing specific to childcare. And one of the things that, I think that maybe we don't all always understand is, just how expensive attrition within the workforce can be, particularly within, kind of high tech companies where the training is very specific and very costly. And anyway, they went around the table and just, relayed to the governor how much money they were losing, how much productivity and profitability they were losing, and it was a fascinating conversation that at the end the governor sort of said, "Wow, I see this in a whole new way. I understand now that the state that really cracks the solution on childcare is going to win the economic development battle, is going to attract more businesses to the state." Is that consistent with what you're hearing in Schuylkill County, and what are the challenges that your members are raising to your attention specifically in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So we are absolutely seeing, similarities here in Schuylkill County. When Bob and I, when we have an event or if we're out at someone else's event, we oftentimes get thanked by members who see us doing this work, and they are, noting that it's an absolute issue, and they are very, thankful that we are trying to help tackle it. So, you know, we don't get thanked too much. Oftentimes it can be a thankless job sometimes, but on this topic, we certainly get thanked by our members for having a voice on this and representing their voice because they're seeing it. Bob mentioned one of the surveys that I did to the parents, but I also did one for employers, and just some quick statistics that were pretty alarming when that survey came back. 69% of Schuylkill County employers have employees who have shared challenges related to finding suitable childcare arrangements that align with their work schedules. And that's something that we see here. We have a lot of manufacturing, logistics, healthcare. So we do have second shift, third shift, weekend shift, and we don't have options for those schedules. So that is absolutely a huge problem. 48.3% of Schuylkill County employers have observed an increase in absenteeism or turnover that could be linked to childcare challenges. And then 55.2% of Schuylkill County employers have encountered difficulties in recruiting or retaining talent due to the childcare landscape, specifically in Schuylkill County. So those were three alarming statistics that did come back from that employer survey. And so, I think I think those numbers are similar across the board, when we look at that.
Samantha, thank you. And again, a reminder, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A in the Zoom toolbar, and we'll get to those in a minute. Catherine, I want to bring you into the conversation. You are and have been studying this in maybe from a little bit different perspective. I think we're talking about the symptoms of this problem. You've been kind of studying the disease itself from an economic perspective. Um, why is this a problem that the free market is having such a difficulty resolving?
I think that's a great question. And so I'm going to back up just a little bit to
Mhm.
define what we mean by free market.
Sure.
So I think at its simplest, it's a market that sets its own price and its own supply through the interaction of buyers and sellers. And so what this means in childcare is that families pay providers directly, and then providers compete for customers, with the market finding its own equilibrium with no significant public investment. And so in most sectors, that works pretty well. But the question is, why isn't it working in childcare? So I'm going to pull in Janet Yellen, who was our former Treasury Secretary. And in 2021, she stated that childcare is a textbook example of a broken market. Now, whenever I say this, I always get pushed back in the room by folks basically telling me that no, no, childcare is fine, it's a free market. And basically, what they mean by that is they believe that centers closing are just a result of parents being unwilling to pay for more childcare, or low wages being that low wages for workers are the fact that parents don't demand high quality childcare. But to me, I think from an economic perspective, I like to push back on this and kind of point to Janet Yellen, who's saying that the market is broken, and kind of point to two key market failures. So the first market failure, I think, is positive externalities, which I believe Nancy did a really great job of explaining earlier, and so did you, Dan, which is really that the price families pay reflects private value, not the broader social value. And so when we look to quality early childcare experiences, I think there's reports by James Heckman and others that have studied really high quality early childcare experiences and shown that this is something that leads to higher high school graduation rates, lower crime rates, higher lifetime earnings, all the things you noted earlier, Dan. But no individual family pays extra for this societal return. And so we have this systematic underinvestment in this system. So that's the first market failure. And then I think the second market failure is something that's really difficult, which is what economists call information asymmetry. And in childcare, it's really difficult for parents to observe the quality of what they're buying. And so while you can taste a burger and you know whether the burger is good in fast food, you can't always look into a childcare center and see brain development that's occurring by just observing an interaction with the teacher. And so that makes quality really difficult to observe, and it makes it really difficult to price. So providers basically want to convince you that they're providing a higher quality experience for your child that's going to lead to a better outcome. But it's hard for parents to then assess that. And then it's hard for providers to then respond and have you pay for that. And so the market has kind of broken in these two ways because we're not really rewarding what actually matters for kids, in part because it's just difficult to observe. So I think this really compounds with a few other issues that I won't go into here to kind of make this a complicated problem and why I think that this market is one in which I don't think is operating as we'd expect.
Weigh in a little bit on I sort of set up in the opening comments what we kind of call the three-legged stool of childcare that it is more costly. We know at this point that infant care, for example, costs more to families in most American states than does housing, than does in-state college tuition. Um, with that in mind, as costly as it is to parents, I think there is sometimes an assumption that childcare businesses are just, raking in cash, hand over fist, but we know that that's not necessarily the case either. I mentioned that it is, premised largely on sort of low low wages of the workforce. We know that, as of, at least a couple of years ago, at the time I was writing my book, The Daycare Myth, the median wage for infant teachers was $13.22 an hour, which was, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 59 cents an hour less than we pay dog walkers in this country. What is the challenge? What would you say to a parent who says, these businesses have plenty of money. This costs more than my house every month. What are the limitations that are keeping these businesses from being able to sort of crack the solution?
Yeah, so I think this is a really great question, and one in which I think you could figure this out yourself by going to look at what's called Form 990s. So all nonprofit childcare businesses have to kind of put out their balance sheets. And so if you really don't believe what I'm about to tell you, you can just take a look at the data yourself and see kind of where all of the money is going. But I think I'm going to provide hopefully a couple convincing explanations for this. So first, this is a highly regulated environment, in part because we really have to set basic standards for providing care. So unlike, again, fast food, which is my straw man in this example, in childcare, we have what's called child to teacher ratios. So you have to have a certain number of adults to every child. And it gets much, much smaller for infants. And this is really important because we want the safety for these infants. You don't want 20 kids to every one teacher, because at that point it becomes an unsafe environment and something bad could happen to your child. And so you really want to make sure that they're safe. And so states are doing a lot to kind of think through what are the necessary regulations to keep a safe environment. And so that's one, child to teacher ratios, two, minimum square footage, minimum caregiver qualification. And on all of these basically set up a regulatory environment that constrains the number of children that centers can actually serve. And what this also means is that childcare has a very unique cost structure. So about 70% of the cost in childcare is labor. And in other service industries like fast food, 30% of the cost is labor. So this is something that becomes really difficult for providers because this is a very large cost for them. And oftentimes the revenue they're getting from these parents is constrained by how much the parents can actually pay. And so then if you take this initial cost and then you layer in all of these additional qualifications that you'd want for quality. So say you want a teacher that has had some amount of early childhood training, that's costly. Training is expensive for these workers, and it's more expensive than in other service industries. And so all at the same time, I think people also underappreciate how fragile the early childcare market is. So we just heard from the folks at Schuylkill that this is a very high turnover workforce. So the workers within childcare are also very high turnover. 36% of workers leave their job every year. And what that means is whenever an employee leaves, this is creating a temporary shortage that the center has to deal with. So this is somebody that they were using to meet the child to teacher ratios. Now they're missing that person. So they either need to have a backup staff member to fill that spot, which is costly, or they need to go out and hire and recruit a new person, which is costly and takes time. And all of this eats into their bottom line because if they aren't able to bring somebody in the short term, that means they can serve less kids. And on the flip side, families are also highly mobile. So they're not staying in child care centers for their entire child's lifespan. They kind of move across different centers, which creates absences. Kids age out of these systems. Families move. Grandparents step in because the cost gets too much. And centers, all the while, are the ones that are facing these uneven costs. And so I think it's really important when we think about the childcare system that we think about the regulatory environment, and then we think about the reality that these providers are facing. And then all of this combines in an area in which multiple people have already noticed where parents just don't have a lot of extra money to contribute to this. So there's all at the same time this liquidity problem. And I think we have, again, this three-legged stool. We have the affordability for parents, we have quality for kids, and we have high wages that we want for our educators. And something has to give in that model. And oftentimes the thing that gives is the wages for the educators. We offer more affordable prices to keep the parents in at the expense of workers' wages. And so I hope that helps to explain some of the challenges that this market faces.
Absolutely does. And I want to get to Elliot, but I just want to throw in as well, as much as we're talking about sort of the business aspects of this, that, that 36% annual turnover rate, Catherine, that you're citing, I've seen estimates of up to 40% annually
Mhm.
of, infant toddler teachers who literally leave the field. They leave the classroom because they can't get there. That has not only a business level impact, but a lot of my own writing has been around the developmental impact of that, the long-term costs that we face in terms of insecure attachment, for example, that during precisely the weeks and months that very young children most need stable, nurturing relationships, what we are providing them instead is a country where 1 in 4 moms have to return to the workforce within 2 weeks of giving birth, and a 40% turnover within center-based childcare, where we're at the time that young children most need this, for the development of attachment, which undergirds then their long-term mental health, that we are instead sort of providing them a revolving door of adults, which has untold economic costs across decades, and by the way, not just for parents, right? Or not just for children, but for all taxpayers who help to support the mental health needs, the physical health needs, the increased reliance on social services in adulthood. The case that I lay out in my book is that the taxpayers are sort of burdened endlessly by our failure to get things right in the first place. Which leads us to my other favorite writer on this topic, Elliot Haspel, who has written so much. Elliot, I know there's probably not a sentence that has been spoken in the past 40 minutes that you have not written about, spoken about, thought about. Want to give you obviously a chance to weigh in on anything and everything that you have heard so far, but also to help us think about, you've sort of argued that we're thinking about this all wrong, right? That the child care is a public good, like a bridge or a road or a public school. How does that change the way that maybe we ought to be thinking about the system, and also then how business leaders, for example, like those in Schuylkill County, might be approaching policymakers around this topic?
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you to everyone on the panel so far. It's been really illuminating. I think, and I really appreciate what you said right before you kind of transitioned, because I think that's so important that we can lose the child in childcare sometimes. And I would go so far as to say, even if a child had no future economic impact from just their inherent dignity as human beings, we want them to have positive experiences as they're growing up. We want families to have positive experiences, to make memories. Like there's a very I think it was Robert F. Kennedy Sr. who famously said, the GDP can tell us everything except that which makes us proud to be Americans, because there is so much else going on in what childcare does for children and for parents and for communities. So just wanted to kind of double underline what you said, because I think that's super important. But your point is right about what kind of my take on this, which is I think we have to back up a step and ask the question, what is childcare and who is it for? Like, what are we even doing here with this system? And my contention is that truly childcare is a critical piece of social and economic infrastructure in such a way that doesn't make sense to ask the market to solve it at all. And there are, if you think about our public schools are a particularly good analogy, I think, because public schools, while not identical to childcare and the delivery shouldn't look identical, they serve many of the same roles. They serve to provide development and learning for children. They serve to be a safe place for parents to leave children while parents are going to work. They're community assets. They're critical anchors to neighborhoods. They're the places that, whether that's disaster aid, they're places we go to shelter. They're also places we go to meet often. There are voting locations. They're critically important pieces of our infrastructure. And to what you said about non-parents, I think if you look at the history of bond measures in this country, the overwhelming majority of which pass, generally speaking, voters who don't have kids are kind of mentally understand, intuitively understand, I need to have a strong public education system. And indeed, it is a right in all 50 state constitutions. It was actually, I read about this, that the Confederate states had to instill a right to public education in their constitutions, basically as a requirement for readmission into the Union after the Civil War. That's how important public education is. And then consider that we spend about $17,000 on average. Lots of state variation, obviously, but about on average, about $17,000 per child in public schools. We spend about $1,500 on average per child children under the age of 5, the overwhelming majority of which goes to 4-year-olds via public pre-K. Imagine if tomorrow we flipped our public schools to $1,500 per kid. The system would fall apart. We would end up in a pay-to-play system. You would have haves and have-nots, teacher pay, which should certainly be higher, but at least in most places is a middle-class salary with, healthcare and retirement. We would plummet. The whole system would fall apart overnight. Now it would have huge economic implications. And so my contention is, rather than ask businesses to necessarily solve this themselves. I recently saw a Nobel Prize winner economist Claudia Golden had an interview about this, and she said, it's not just me. She said there's really no reason for employers to be providing childcare. Employers don't provide public school. And right, the concept is comical. Like, we don't ask an employer, no matter how large or small, to provide the third grade. We don't ask them to provide a stipend for their employees to go acquire the third grade. We just make the third grade available to everyone as a matter of right, from the poorest American to the richest American. And so that's my contention, is that if what we're truly saying is that childcare meets the bar for being a public good, similar to public schools, then we should pay for it with tax dollars. We should make it a right. We should make it universal. We should make it if it's available to everyone. And the role of businesses in that situation is to advocate for such a system and to be willing to pay into it through tax dollars. And the example I often point to here is Vermont. For those of you who don't know, what Vermont, back in 2023, passed a small payroll tax, 0.44%. And it was done really on the backs of the employers coming to the Vermont legislature and saying, in as many words, tax me if you need to do that. Like, this is a problem for me personally. This is a problem for our community. Vermont was also worried, even demographically, an aging state that was bleeding parents with young children. And they said, we can't solve this ourselves. We don't want to solve this ourselves. Please essentially solve this for us and take our tax dollars. Vermont has been wildly successful so far in more than a few years into implementation. They're growing their workforce, they're growing their capacity. Parent fees are plummeting. Educator wages are rising. It's not perfect. Of course, it's not perfect, but they have made huge strides. And that wouldn't have happened if the business community hadn't stepped up and advocated via public policy for there to be a governmental solution to childcare. So when I think about, how do we take this and translate that, I think that's the place we need to be looking, is how do we get businesses advocating rather than necessarily trying to run childcare through businesses.
Elliot, you raised Vermont as an example, and there are lots of interesting state examples that are happening now. It raises a really timely question that I wanted you and Catherine and maybe the rest of the panel, to the extent that they have opinions on. But roughly 2 weeks ago, President Trump was interviewed, and in the context, obviously, of the war in Iran, but made a statement basically that the federal government isn't well equipped to take care of things like childcare, like healthcare, that and not an argument against those things, but the framing was, this is probably not a great federal responsibility, that the federal government needs to be responsible for things like the protection of the nation and a strong military, but that those more human services, sorts of needs are better approached by the states. Do you have a sense of, when you're talking about making this a public good, does that happen at the federal level or the state level? And what are the pros and cons maybe of the different approaches there?
Yeah, so I'll talk briefly because I know we're kind of time, and I want my
Yeah.
fellow panelists to weigh on this too. I think it's going to be a combination. Ultimately, we're going to need the federal government to be involved just from a sheer funding standpoint. Where we are now in the 2020s is not where we were in the 1860s and 1870s when states were starting to stand up their mass public schools. States do not have the funding base in most cases to fully fund a system on their own. And then you're also going to end up with haves and have-nots. It shouldn't be the case, in my view, that which side of the state border you on determines whether or not you have access to good child care. At the same time, the idea of should states be looking to amend their constitutions to establish a right to child care? Yeah, I think they should. I think that's going to happen a lot sooner than we're going to see an amendment to the federal constitution. So I do think, and states are obviously going to have to play a major, major role in the implementation. So in view of a system where the federal government is largely providing, significant to a bulk of the funding, but states are still obviously putting skin in the game, and they're the ones who are busy implementing in their own states because state context, as you all know, vary wildly as well. That to me seems to be the most legible way forward.
Catherine, what are your thoughts on that
Yeah,
question?
I would largely agree. As a spouse of an active duty military member,
Mm.
my husband and I talk about this all the time. And I think there's like a couple other key considerations I think are really important. And so I just kind of want to draw a parallel between childcare and then how this works in other industries. So if you look at Title I funding in public schools or Medicaid, there's always been this kind of federal floor and then state flexibility. And I think to Elliot's point, it's really important to allow states to have some amount of control because they have a better understanding of their local constituencies. But I think that the federal government provides a really important support in setting standards and then providing some funding. So both in Title I, if we look at the public school system, the federal government's only providing about 10% of the budget. But it does a good job, I think, of setting quality standards and what it means for for states to achieve accountability. And I think we need some sort of floor like that to ensure that all states aren't kind of racing to the bottom on standards when states are trying to compete for businesses coming in. I think the other thing that's really important here is to think about the the nice thing about the federal government is that it doesn't have to have a balanced budget resolution like almost every state in the US has to. And so what that really means is that the federal government has more flexibility around spending than states do. And so I think again, this partnership needs to come into place because when we're thinking about investing as much as we really need to invest, states likely don't have that much money outside of the exceptions of New Mexico and DC, where they've gotten really creative. And then I think one final point I'm going to make is that I think going back to Elliot's point, I really want to like drive home the point that we're currently spending close to $13,000 per child per year in K-5. The investment, if you think about the child to teacher ratios that we were talking about earlier and the cost of care and childcare, even if even if we were to raise the level of public investment for the 0 to 4 year olds, we would need quite drastically more than $13,000 per year to provide the level of quality care that all of us expect. And so that level of investment is very large. And so I think for states to be able to absorb that, it would just on their own, it would be very difficult.
Well, maybe in wrapping up that question would just sort of echo Catherine and Elliot what you both had to say. I mean, there are some really exciting things happening in states across the country. New Mexico is a great example where virtually universal childcare is now in the process of being rolled out. But it is interesting to see to this question of sort of equitable access to services, Elliot, that the question of what side of the state line you live on. I mean, I think that's being illustrated in real time right now, right? That there are some states that are really taking some bold leadership steps in this space, and it is definitely highlighting the differences between what you might get in one state versus what you might get in another. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to try to prioritize getting to as many audience questions as we can. Panel, because we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left. I mean, we'll try to do sort of a speed round here and be as brief in answering as possible. Nancy, a interesting question about your studies in the chat about sort of the equitability of the survey methodology, asking if you were able to talk to all different types of families, those that are, at different income levels, those that might speak a language other than English. Did the methodology account for that? And if it did, is there data around, are there is there greater loss to certain families, to some families as comparison to others?
Dan, I'll be happy to share the technical report that's
Hmm.
behind the flashy report. And our surveyors did look at different groups of people, trying to break it down as closely as possible by what we have in the nation. I've not been able to dig into whether these folks speak a different language. I can
Hmm.
talk with the economists. We did look at race, ethnicity, marital status, education, age, where their residence is. But the results that when we talked to parents to make sure we had a good diversity, we do not have a breakdown of the results by those particular categories, though.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating place to dig in future reports, if nothing else, to sort of look at, the overwhelming bulk, as you mentioned, of the losses in the economy are borne by parents, right? In the form of lost or foregone wages and lost opportunities for promotions, and the list goes on and on. It would be fascinating to know if certain categories of family experience that more even than others. Catherine, want to ask you. Aruna is asking an interesting question, sort of about the Ready Nation study. She's noting that $172 billion figure captures essentially what our current inaction um, yields for us. And she's asking, I would love to hear your thinking around what the return looks like if we actually do it right instead. I mean, is there potential to not only offset, the very substantial losses that Ready Nation has documented, but then to look at, what we might gain, maybe in terms of savings elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think part of the problem with this is that there's not a ton of workforce data that exists that's ready to be analyzed. And so to all of the business leaders out there, I would suggest that you start looking into your data a little bit more. And then also, I think, when we think about policy simulations, I think that's an area in which I think there's been a lot of growth recently. So if we were to invest in childcare and we were to increase the supply of childcare, what would be like the surplus for businesses, and instead of thinking in a deficit mindset, thinking in the positive. And so I think there's a lot of research going on in that field, and I think that's an interesting way to frame the problem, that can also maybe help legislators both see the problem through the Ready Nations report, but then also be able to see what a potential solution might mean to their local economy, and then how we could advance from there.
That's great. But Bob and Samantha, this might be a place that you could weigh in. Michelle is noting that, one of the things that she is experiencing is that when she takes this kind of data to the employers, and businesses that she's working with locally, that they're saying, well, my employees aren't raising this as an issue. Um, do you have a sense of, she's speculating that maybe parents don't want to admit that this is a challenge. Maybe that, that it's easier to say I'm not feeling well than to say I'm having a childcare challenge.
Yeah,
Do you have a sense of?
well, first of all, I think a common thing for an employee would be to not want to talk too much about what's encumbering them to get
Yeah.
into the workforce. because if they love their job, they want to keep their job. But I believe it's very simple that most businesses are providing the wage and the benefits that they can to keep their people. The myth that businesses are not giving their employees everything they can, I think, needs to be crushed, because everybody knows that retention of employees is critical, because the retraining cost to replace them is ridiculously high. So every employer that's worth anything, somebody that's going to stay in business long term, is going to try to give everything they can to their associates. And this simply is just not high enough on the scale when you get done with wages, health care, and a couple other benefits like dental, things like that. And therefore, I believe most employees know that this has become their responsibility. And while they can talk to their bosses about it, what they do is really expose what could be the problems in their family, which might draw an employer to kind of doubt their capability to work for them long term. So sometimes honesty is the best policy, but I think most employees are not going to bare their soul knowing that their employer is unlikely to be able to financially provide a lot in this sector.
Yeah.
I think,
And we're going to, oh, go ahead, Samantha.
sorry, just really quickly, I think another way to look at it too, and something that I've seen, especially like during COVID, some people decided that they were able to, exist on a one income household. And so I think that sometimes what we see is people leaving the workforce, and they're living in a one household income. So that person who is going to work might be saying, this isn't a problem for me, but they don't want to talk about the financial struggles that they're experiencing by being a one income household, because their significant other or their partner left the workforce. So it might not be, their employees might not be expressing to them that it is an issue for them because they're the ones who stayed in the workforce, but they're not going to maybe talk to them about their spouse left the workforce, or, my spouse is really unhappy and really wants to be in the workforce. But, just because it, like Bob just said, like they'll talk a little bit about it, but it's not, something they're going to probably divulge.
Well, this may be a conversation that we want to revisit. I feel like we could have hours of additional conversation here. There's so many questions in the chat that unfortunately we weren't able to get to, but I know we're past the top of the hour, and I definitely want to keep to the promise we've made in terms of the timeline. I'm sure people have to drop off and move on to other opportunities. Let me thank our panel in particular. Nancy Fishman is the national director at Ready Nation, whose reports are available. Nancy, one quick thing for you before we go. I know that the sort of the home organization of Ready Nation has changed in recent years, and so am I right in thinking that the reports are actually on two different websites?
They are, and several people have been kind enough to share the link in the chat. The best place to look for this report is on the Institute for Child Success's website. You can also find it at the National Collaborative for Infants and Toddlers.
Great. So if you, in my experience, if you're looking for the infant toddler report from a couple of years back, if you Google Ready Nation, you'll find that readily at the old website for Ready Nation, and the new report is under the broader umbrella of the Institute for Child Success in Greenville, South Carolina. So Nancy, thank you, Bob and Samantha from the Schuylkill Chamber of Commerce. We are so grateful for you taking time out of your busy schedules as well. Dr. Catherine Sadowski, economist and assistant professor of education at Stanford, and Elliot Haspel, a senior fellow at Capita and a master writer and thinker on this childcare space. We're so grateful to all of you for taking time out to participate in this conversation, and grateful to all of you who took time out of your busy schedules to tune in today. We'll continue this conversation over time, and hopefully maybe we can have some of these panelists back to to talk a little bit more. We will be back in May, details shortly, and then I can tell you that I'm very excited that in June we will be talking to my dear friend and an amazing thought leader in this space, Dr. Dana Suskind. Dana has a new book that will be coming out in early July on sort of the impacts of AI and children, and so we'll be talking with Dana about her new book. So more information on all of that coming very soon. For now, wish everybody a wonderful Monday afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.